So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this session on new storytelling formats. My name is Hiba Ali. I'm in Geneva, Switzerland, and I run a nonprofit newsroom called The New Humanitarian, which reports exclusively about humanitarian crises around the world, from conflict to disasters to refugee flows to epidemics. So we are, as you might imagine, quite busy these days, and really looking forward to being part of a conversation with so many women from around the world. So I love this initiative. We're going to be talking a bit about how to rethink the way we as journalists tell stories, and how we want those stories to be told and received, particularly in an age of COVID-19. And how storytelling formats can also help us reach new audiences and rise above some of the noise out there, in the age of social media, in the age of misinformation. It's interesting because at the New Humanitarian, we were founded in 1995, and we at that time sent out our stories by fax machine. So you can imagine the evolution in formats we've had since then, from video to podcasting to cartoons to live events. So I'm looking forward to hearing how others are also faring in this space. We've got three wonderful speakers with us, and I'll introduce them in turn. Mia Malan is in Johannesburg, South Africa. She is founding editor of Bekasisa Center for Health Journalism, which is an independent media organization that specializes in narrative solutions journalism, focusing on health and social justice issues across Africa. She has 25 years of experience in journalism, in fundraising, and institution building, both in legacy media and in digital native publications. So welcome to you, Mia. Oh, you're just on mute.
Apologies. Thank you very much, Heba.
We also have with us from Kuala Lumpur, Aidila Razak, an award-winning data journalist and special reports editor at Malaysia, sorry, I knew this would happen, Malaysia Kini, which is a leading independent media site in Malaysia, covering political and current affairs, publishing in 4 languages and reaching more than 1 million unique visitors every month. She's been a journalist for 11 years, is very passionate also about social justice and human rights issues, as well as good governance, and particularly likes using data and technology to cover or to find new ways of telling stories. So we'll surely get into some of that. Hi, Aidila.
Oh.
And finally, we have from Myanmar with us today, Winzar Niang, who goes by Sani. She is a multimedia journalist who is currently a senior producer for the Dohathan podcast, which is produced in partnership with Frontier Myanmar magazine, also with about 1 million listeners every month across various platforms. And the podcast shines a light on human rights issues affecting the people of Myanmar. She has also been an editor and deputy chief reporter for Myanmar National Television, a video journalist for Up to Date channel under Skynet, and has written print stories for Frontier Media, both in English and in Myanmar languages, as well as training, which you have been involved in for various partner media organizations around the country. So welcome, Sani.
Hello.
So we wanted to start just by hearing from each of you a little bit about your newsrooms, your organizations, what you do, what kind of storytelling formats you use, and then get into a discussion around how COVID is creating some opportunities in terms of storytelling, but also perhaps some responsibilities. So maybe I can turn first to you, Mia, in just telling us a little bit more about Bekasisa and your work in South Africa.
Sure, thank you very much, Heba. So Bekasisa, as you mentioned, is an independent media organization, but we didn't start off independently. We started off as part of the Mail and Guardian, which is an investigative newspaper in South Africa. And then about a year ago, or a little bit more, 18 months ago, we became a separate organization, and we now provide our copy for our own website, but also for other publications in the country, 3 major publications here. And we specialize in solutions journalism journalism, which is it's journalism that evaluates solutions and see if they work or not, so that there's lessons to be learned from it. Not everything we do is solutions journalism, but I would say about 2/3 of it. And we normally do also narrative, long form narrative journalism, and we do a bit of video and podcasting, and we also do a lot of analysis of specifically health policy. But when COVID arrived, we had to change things a little bit, because our audience normally is a very niche one. So it's decision makers, policy makers, academics, high profile politicians, activists. But with COVID, our audience started to broaden, and also the issues that we covered were necessarily so much more scientific that we had to make provision to do stories in one story in different formats, so that there is an opportunity for everyone to understand it. So something that happened to our journalism during COVID is that we started to do more videos, specifically explanatory videos, that would explain what is a PCR test, or, what is the R value when you look at how common infections are. And we also started to do a form of podcasting that we never did before, audiograms. So we would, for instance, look at, say, a national press conference, and if there was a scientist explaining stuff, we would take short sound bites of that and make the one sound bite, a 45-second sound bite, a story, because it would, for instance, be something like, why don't we have evidence to show that TB vaccines work for COVID vaccines? That was a huge issue in South Africa at the beginning of the epidemic. And we would then subtitle it, and we would have a picture on it, and we would distribute it on social media, but also actually file on our website as a story, because it makes the science absorbable, and it's only one point that you address, and specifically if it was a scientist that explained things in easy ways. So that's something that we started to do quite commonly that we never did before. We wouldn't have thought this constitutes a story, but the need for information necessitated it. And another thing that we did was we started with a resource section on our website. We didn't have that before. So with all the government regulations for lockdowns that were announced, we needed to find a way to let people know about the regulations and not have it in the form of a story, because that would just be repetitive of what other organizations do, and it wouldn't have a sort of like an evergreen value. And we then started to file this as a resource section. It's often bullet points, but we would translate the regulations and just highlight the most important ones for those for those people who really don't want to read through a whole lot of government regulations. And that has drawn a lot of traffic to our website, and it was something that we didn't necessarily expect that way. And the other thing that happened is we had a lot of partnerships, opportunities for partnerships during this time that I don't think we would have had otherwise. And those are partnerships with media organizations that I don't think we would have had partnerships, say television stations and community media organizations, that we wouldn't have had, we wouldn't have formed partnerships as quickly and so many during a short time if it wasn't for a pandemic.
So interesting. And I think it would resonate with a lot of other newsrooms hearing what you say, particularly in, so many media saw a rise in audiences as people were just looking for information about, as you say, what is the latest regulation? How does that affect my life? And so to be able to not only take advantage of that, but really offer a service to readers makes a whole lot of sense. And we can maybe come back to the point around partnerships, because I think in this age of COVID, in which so many media are struggling financially, there's more and more reason for us to be collaborating. So I look forward to unpacking some of that. But first, I'm going to turn to Adila for your just introductory thoughts on both a little bit more about what you do and on how storytelling formats are evolving.
Sure. So just an introduction about Malaysia Kini. Malaysia Kini is an independent news website, and we were started in 1998. So we're digital native. We don't have print, but since 1998, it's a long time. So we've had to change a lot along the way. Primarily, we're like a breaking news website. We do the politics, we do all the stuff. But in the past couple of years, we've started investing in finding new ways of doing journalism, using technology, using different formats of storytelling, and different ways of dissemination. Because we found that most of our audience were older, because they started following us in 1998, so they're older. So we wanted to reach to a younger audience who had a different way of consuming news. So we started this thing called the Kini News Lab, which experiments with different ways of presenting, doing, and basically disseminating news. And this lab has actually been quite pivotal in this period because it has been able to innovate in the way that we process all the information about the pandemic and how we present it. Had we not have, if we didn't have this sort of team that could do this, we would have probably been filing news stories or long articles, like Mia said, which people had to parse through to get the information. But this lab was able to take all this information and presented it in formats that are easy to consume, either through infographics, which were shareable on social media, or interactive infographics, which people could customize to what they need. And one of the products of the Kini News Lab in this pandemic is this thing we call the COVID News Tracker, the COVID Tracker, basically, which basically it's all the information that's coming out from the government about the pandemic, about the regulations. Also tries to give more information which the government does not provide, and everything is in one place, which is really important because in Malaysia, unfortunately, we don't have freedom of information, and there's no culture of providing information by the government. And information is provided in non-machine readable text or all over the place, and people really have to do a lot of work to get the most basic information. So we decided that this is a time where people need information to act safely and to be more informed about how to behave, basically. So because we had the Kini News Lab, we were able to build something to collate everything in one place and present it in a way that people could look at it at the end of the day and understand where we are in this pandemic.
Interesting to hear you talk about the freedom of information in Malaysia. I think certainly what we have seen in many of the countries we cover, including as far as Latin or Central America, but also Tanzania, for example, where there wasn't really trust in the government and its particularly its statistics about COVID. And so you saw people turning more and more to independent media to try to get a truer picture of the situation. Before we move on to Natty, I just wanted to get a better sense of what makes the Kini News Lab different from what you were doing before. What makes it able to disseminate in more innovative ways?
Well, primarily before even though we were digital, we were still a lot of text and traditional video and things like that just on a website. So what the News Lab does is it changes the way this information is presented. Instead of a long article, you would have to just maybe do a short quiz, which takes you a minute and provides you with customized information of how this regulation, how the lockdown affects you. You can just answer 5 questions and then you get a list instead of going through a long article, for example. And because we put the data into this tracker thing, it creates charts which people can get in real time, basically, of the information. So these are things that we wouldn't be able to do had we not built things like that. It's tools that are existing, but sometimes not really used for journalism.
Really interesting. Sunny, I want to turn to you now. Tell us about the Dohatan podcast and your work in Myanmar.
Yes, we published Dohatan podcast for 3 years ago, and then is we mainly focus on the human rights issues, especially we producing human rights podcasts and videos and creating COVID-19 weekly websites during the COVID-19 periods. And at first, my mother media organization is Frontier Myanmar. Frontier Myanmar is a magazine. We produce twice a month magazine. We publish twice a month in the magazine. And during the COVID-19, we can't publish the magazine, and we change our news is changed to from the digital version. Mostly we upload the story in the digital versions, and the chance during the COVID-19 is we got the project about COVID-19 related with COVID-19, and So we produce COVID-19 weekly project podcast every week, and produce video as well, human rights videos.
And who are you reaching mostly with your podcasts and your videos?
Actually, we have so many affiliated organization, 7 affiliated organization. We have 7 partner organizations, and in across the country, we work together with them, and we upload our podcast on their platforms, and including VOA, Voice of America, Burmese version. We work together with them, and they produce our podcast on their platform on Saturday, on the weekend. Yes.
It comes back to the point Mia was making earlier about partnerships. So maybe we can come back to that point. I mean, there have been many opportunities arising out of the pandemic in terms of how to tell stories differently. And one of them, I think, is that media organizations are more open to partnerships. So I wonder, Mia, if you could tell us about a few of the partnerships that you have that have emerged for you in the midst of COVID, and kind of the advantages that they have brought.
National television stations in South Africa called Newsroom Africa wanted to have science journalists to explain the science of COVID essentially. And they got in touch with us and offered us a daily slot on their primetime show to either talk about a story that we did for the day or a general COVID issue. And we did that for what must be 6 to 8 months. And we're continuing this year, but this has now evolved to a bigger partnership where we're going to start a weekly health program on Newsroom Africa and produce it in collaboration with them. And I don't think we would have thought of doing this as quickly if it wasn't for the epidemic. And of course, what we got from it was a wider audience. We didn't have a television audience, and we became wider known. And what they got from it was, journalists with a scientific background and who can accurately talk about science, while their own journalists could continue to cover the issues that they cover without, I'm sure they also developed in science, but they didn't have to train them especially. They could use us for those aspects. The other interesting partnership is, we have a decision-making audience. So we generally partner with organizations that are decision makers, health organizations, for instance, for webinars. We would never have thought of partnering with a community media organization because that's not really the audience that we're trying to reach. But during lockdown, our journalists couldn't travel. We generally would travel to rural areas to get grassroots voices. And there was then a community organization called Iwoza, which trains its scientists, but they and media, very community media-like people, and they train residents of a very large township in Cape Town in South Africa called Khayelitsha to tell their health stories. In this case, it was COVID stories. And they had very different issues than other parts of the country that they faced. For instance, they need to access social grants, and all of a sudden they could only queue up with 30 people on a day. So they took very long for them to access the grants, or the risk of infection when they queue up through the night to get one of the 30 spots the next day, and there's a risk of infection if they're around a fire because it was cold and in winter. So we were then able to access those voices and those consistent issues. There were a lot of evictions, for instance, during COVID in Khayelitsha. So we would never have been able to access those voices if it wasn't for the fact that we could partner with Iwoza. But more than that, what Iwoza got out of it was a wider audience because we have partner organizations, but also that we could help them with professional television script writing. So we could help them to adjust what they did. We could edit the scripts and they would edit the pictures and get all the stories, and they would come with the story ideas, but we could help them to develop that for mainstream audiences. And we then eventually co-applied for a grant from the National Research Foundation here in South Africa, and now got some funds to continue with that, but beyond COVID, to also do HIV and TB stuff. So that's also a bit of a longer partnership. And one of their community journalists, which is essentially a resident from Khayelitsha who learned how to film, is going to come and spend some time with us here now in Johannesburg at Bekisisa, and we're going to share multimedia skills with him to help him to develop, their script writing skills and stuff. So that's a great partnership. And another one that was really useful is, in all the countries, and we're not unique in that way that we started with a dashboard, but in all countries, there is a lot of data that's being released about COVID, and it's very hard to get meaning from it. Initially you hear how many infections, but after 2 months, that's not so interesting any longer. And it's very hard to create meaning, to make it meaningful for yourself. And it's hard to understand data if you're not a data person. And we wanted to take that data and present it in a meaningful way to our decision-making audience, but also to ordinary people. And during a pandemic, that's not the time to all of a sudden gain skills that you didn't have you can't in a week all of a sudden become a data journalist, and that's not the time to do it. A better way of doing it is to partner with an organization that really knows well how to do it. So there's another media startup called MediaHack here in South Africa that's really great at visualizing data, and we then partnered with them to create a COVID dashboard, which would include from daily figures, interpreting it with graphs, and for instance, now that we a year into the pandemic, no longer just looking at the daily figures, but for instance, looking at which other countries have curfews, because everyone is complaining about curfews in South Africa. And then it would help with the understanding that it's not just us, and the other curfews. And for instance, today, MediaHack released this, looking at what are the times of the curfews, when does it end mostly? Is it sort of like 5 to 10 in the 5 in the morning till 10 in the evening, or how does it work? And I think it helps to make people more tolerant of their situation when they understand what other countries is doing. And what we got from it is that we could host this dashboard on our website, but we also got co-branding from it. And what MediaHack got from it, they really the brainchild behind it, not us, but is that they got a wider audience, and we also could provide them with some funds for the dashboard. During COVID, there was a lot of grants that became available, and we applied for a Facebook grant and then could allocate some of that money to them. And we also had contacts to access some information that's not always that accessible within the health department. We could help them with that. So it is a really great partnership that's continuing. And that dashboard is, used by academics in the country. It's quoted by the Ministerial Advisory Committee when they have briefings, because it's really accurate, but it also provides different levels of depth of information. And something really interesting that he did was when we had a very strict hard lockdown, and there was one rule that said that you could only move within a 5 kilometer radius of your house. And MediaHack then created an application where you could say where you lived, and then it would go to that spot, and it would show you, what is the range that you could move in, where you can't go beyond, which was really useful for people, an ordinary person not knowing where to go. So those are our 3 main partnerships, and it's been really satisfying, and beyond the dashboard, MediaHack then started to help us with other data stories. For instance, we wanted to look at how did the coronavirus travel through South Africa, and how do you tell that in an interesting way? You can't just do a narrative around it. People will lose track of what you're talking about. So we then had an interactive story with little data maps in between. We even looked at where did the virus that ended up in South Africa come from? Did it come from China? And we looked at genetic sequencing. And because it was presented in interesting, creative ways, it's something that an ordinary person can absorb. And even if it's a decision maker, not everyone specializes in all forms of infectious diseases. So it might be new for even an academic in another field to absorb that type of information. And I think it's gotten a lot of traction in that way.
Yeah, these are just incredible examples of the opportunity when you start looking at where you can bring your skills and strengths and then match them with another organization's, and hopefully something that lasts well beyond COVID, because it can just be so powerful. And I was interested when you were mentioning particularly the data partnership, because I know the Gates Foundation is also now trying to support a number of media organizations to connect and create a kind of Africa COVID data hub project. And we've been in discussions with them about this initiative, which is being overseen by the Open Cities Lab in South Africa, as it happens.
Yes.
And again, trying to help media access reliable data and then communicate that out to the wider public. Adil, I'm interested, you've been kind of nodding along as Mia was speaking, given that you are a data journalist, what you've seen in terms of how data is resonating with the public in new ways, perhaps during this pandemic.
Yes, well, I think before, I really feel like the level of data that people consume, the things that we are putting out now, I used to think that it was just for the nerds. I didn't think that people want to go down to that level. But yes, now I'm getting messages on social media asking me what are the hotspots now? What is the infection rate in this part of my state, for example? So those are things that I don't think ordinary people would care about so much before, because now these things are affecting them directly. So in a way, I mean, this pandemic has created some sort of data literacy in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially when you have kind of, you were talking earlier about databases that people can tailor and customize and so on. Are you seeing a lot of pickup on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. So whenever we produce something that people can customize or to basically just find out information that affects me, that gets a lot more usage compared to like a general one. Even something as simple as an infographic where people can just look at one part of the infographic that affects them and not the other, even if it's not interactive, even if it's flat. I mean, those things do a lot better. I think mostly because the stuff that is coming out of the government is a bit convoluted and not so easy to understand. Everything's there. We're just doing the job of translating it into something that's much easier to consume, which I think is also what Mia talked about earlier. There's a lot of information out there. You just need to kind of make it understandable for people.
Sunny, I want to come back to you. I mean, we at the New Humanitarian just launched a podcast late last year and already have seen it really picking up steam and gaining in popularity just in these past few months. And I think the podcasting world, of course, has exploded in recent years.
Yes.
Is your sense that that the pandemic has made podcasts even more popular, or is there any kind of interaction there between those two trends?
And actually, podcast is trend now state in Myanmar. Most people know the podcast very well in this day. When during the pandemic, so many podcasts came out, especially lifestyle, business, and funny podcasts, and so many podcasts that made by youth came out in our country, and even we can listen the podcast on Juice application. Is sound application is related with the sound. We can listen in the Juice application, and people listen the funny podcast, and they are familiar with the podcast, and in this day, and I think podcast is trending now during the pandemic, and most people podcast and more should make podcasts because it can easily do, and podcast can made by ourselves without using an inexpensive equipment. We can record from in our own, and we can interview from our home, so it's easy to do a podcast. And so I think during the pandemic, youth made podcasts by themselves, and some made an organization. Yeah.
We've talked about podcasts, about data journalism, about now renewed interest in explanatory journalism, in solutions journalism. I wonder, particularly when it comes to the fight against misinformation and disinformation, which new storytelling formats you've found to be most effective in the various countries and regions that you work in being able to spread true information just as widely or fight against that tide.
Yeah.
If any of you have experiences you want to share, go ahead, Sunny.
Yes. in Myanmar, data journalist is training during the COVID-19. There's a three trend. The three trend main is in Myanmar as data journalism, podcasts, and videos are very trend in Myanmar during the COVID-19, and data journalism is for the misinformation and disinformation. Most media outlet in Myanmar use data journalism, data visualization, and most media outlets in Myanmar use how should I say? Infograph for to show the data, how many affected, how many cases found in Myanmar, and how they affected like this. And at first, when before the first case was found in Myanmar in March. At the time, the Ministry of Health announced the data, the cases, announced the cases, but it's very confused and complicated, and people don't understand well. So it's a wrong information and disinformation appear in the Facebook, in the social media platform, on the social media platform. So after that, most media outlets made infographics and graphics with the cases with the infographics, how many cases, and how can the most how should I say cluster, the location of the cluster. They make the infographic with the location of the cluster, and people like it a lot, and it really affected in Myanmar. Yes, yes, data journalism, especially infographics.
Mia, Adila, other kind of successful tactics, I guess, in the fight against misinformation?
What we have found is that all formats work, but it depends on how you present it in those formats. So if you, for instance, look at a print story, if you want to counter misinformation, people are, you want to reach a broad audience if you want to counter that. And broad audiences tend to access listicles, a format in a listicle format, stories. So for instance, 5 things that's not true about, COVID. They tend to read a story like that much easier because it's, it has points. You can decide which point you want to read. You don't have to read the whole thing, but it's easier to read. So that helps. What we have also found is with videos and podcasts, the shorter and more focused during a time where there's so much data to absorb and science that's hard to understand, the better. So don't try and be smart with a long narrative thing, rather break it down. And the third thing is that we have definitely at Bekisisa started to do the same story in different formats because you reach different audiences and you get to break down different aspects of the story. So we would, for instance, say during the time of hydroxychloroquine, it was quite big in South Africa, we would have a story for the policymakers and the decision makers that looks at the science and states all the peer-reviewed studies and how it works. And then we would take a small part of that story and make a video for GPs who's prescribing it and don't have the time to read or don't necessarily want to read the other article, and circulate that. And then on top of that, we might have a soundbite that we just circulate on social media. And those forms tend to complement each other and have a cumulative effect when it comes to countering misinformation. So essentially, keep it short, keep it focused. Don't try and be smart and present all the science of one aspect. It doesn't go down, people don't absorb it, and try and do the same story in different formats and do it in a format that is accessible. So when it comes to video, we started to do many videos, Al Jazeera-like videos, the Al Jazeera Plus videos, where things would pop up onto screens in funky ways. Previously, we would have had slower videos, we would have taken more time to make it nice and arty. Here it was about get the information out there and make it snappy and easy to, make it feel easier because it's difficult information, and make it short.
I like that advice. Don't try to be too smart. Adila, what about you?
we found actually that explainers do really, really well. Your basic Q&A. But again, just like Mia said, you can do a Q&A explaining the science and get really technical about it, or you can just really explain it, imagine that you're explaining it to a 5-year-old and then write it in a way that people still understand. I had this discussion with our kind of science journalist, I suppose, and he was writing the Q&A about vaccines, and he was trying to explain in a lot of paragraphs what is mRNA. And he was trying hard to explain because he didn't want people to think that it will change your genetics and all these other things. Because I didn't understand what he was trying to say. I said, what exactly were you trying to say? He said, I just want people to not think that it will change your genetics. So I said, so just say that. What is mRNA is this thing, and it doesn't change your genetics. I mean, you don't really need to get into all that because people don't really want to get into all that, at least the audience that we have. So explainers work. Another thing that I really like that have come through is how we use Instagram stories. Instagram stories and Twitter threads, those work as well. So things that are short, easy to consume, and shareable.
Yeah, especially on the shareable point, it's been really interesting to see the rise of Telegram, WhatsApp, other messaging
Telegram
apps.
Telegram, absolutely. So Malaysia was not a big Telegram using country before. We were mostly on WhatsApp, but now Telegram is huge because information, everyone wants to subscribe to a channel that gets them the information quickly. So Telegram is huge now, and we use it a lot to disseminate information about the pandemic at certain intervals, so people wait for it.
That's using, those have always also been the channels through which misinformation spreads the fastest. So trying to use those same channels to spread the real information is interesting to see kind of who wins that battle.
Yeah, well, it's not. I don't really know whether we are winning or not, but the idea is you need to be there where the information is spreading. If you do it elsewhere, the people who are consuming the misinformation will not see what you're trying to debunk.
That's right. Before we close, I just thought I'd hear from each of you, some practical steps for journalists or organizations that are looking to improve their storytelling, particularly at this point in history when, as we've discussed, there's just so much competition for attention and so much information out there. I mean, we've talked already about the different formats that have worked and so on, but if you're a journalist or someone who provides information to journalists and are looking for ways forward, do you have any recommendations? Sunny, I see you nodding already.
Yes, so we are thinking for the future, the new storytelling styles for to attend our podcasts and video for the video as well. For the videos, we will think about so now we call it a online journalism. It makes 1 minute videos, and we put the subtitle and sound in the 1 minute videos, and it's very effective one. Another one is we are trying to make a video with how should I say? We are trying to make a video with the infographics, and it's a data. It's the best way. Yeah.
Thank you, Sunny. Also appreciate this isn't your first language, and it's so humbling to see you really making such an effort to communicate with us. Thank you for that. Mia, maybe over to you for any practical tips.
I think something that COVID has changed a lot in journalism, Heba, is it's forced all journalists to report on health issues, to essentially become a health journalist overnight. And those skills didn't necessarily come overnight. And it's so difficult because it is not just normal science, it's the fastest changing science that we've dealt with in a very long time. So something that we have found very useful here is to try and build strong relationships with scientists, not just to access information, but to check our stories. We have been used to reporting on science. That's what we've been doing since we started 7 years ago. We are now 7 years later at a stage where we have more scientists checking our stories than 7 years ago. You would think that we're more comfortable now. We are, but COVID science changes and people have different opinions. And one scientist, even scientists get it wrong. They would still think it's the case. And then tomorrow a new study comes out that changes things. And it's so dangerous when you have a good intention to write a story and then there's just wrong information in it without a bad intention to have bad information. So we really now try and build relationships where scientists would give us time to make sure that our stories are accurate. And it's interesting. They are very appreciative of it, more appreciative than previously, because it's so much in the interest of everyone to get the information out there and accurately. The other thing is something that was just mentioned is when it's videos and podcasts, subtitle it. It takes time, but so many people don't put on the sound. They see it on Facebook or they see it on social media, and they're not in an environment where they can even put on the sound. I don't have statistics on it, but I think a lot of our viewers and audience access, at least half of them probably, access it without putting on the sound. So it's very valuable to do that. Those would be my lessons. And also attend courses where you can. There's so many opportunities. One thing that COVID brought for us is webinars. We would never have been able to access all this information around the world if it wasn't for that. And I personally never attended a webinar before COVID. It was better if it was in person. I was so wrong. And there are so many opportunities. And the nice thing is you can rewind it. You can go back, when you have the recording that you can't do in a real person, real life event. So use that opportunity.
And similarly, I think in terms of us organizing our own events as newsrooms, we have now the scope to kind of reach anywhere in the world and just a much wider range of sources than we might have been able to for live events. So that for us has certainly been a real game changer and just opening it right up. And frankly, people have more time because they're all at home now. So you can access busy decision makers somehow more easily than you might have in the past. Adila, any last thoughts in terms of practical steps for improved storytelling in this new era?
I actually really like what Mia said about experts, because we all have to suddenly become experts in this overnight, and it's impossible. So we really need partnerships with public health experts, etc. I found that in this period, because I have been doing a lot of COVID reporting and maintaining our tracker, lots of experts are actually reaching out to me to tell me information that I wouldn't know, or about information about something that's not quite right in the hospitals, for example. So, I mean, this is a great time to actually reach out to those experts because they really want to talk to you right now. And also on the other side, for the public health sector, it's also a time where journalists really want your help right now. So if you can put out things that are informational, easy to consume, that this is like the best time for it.
One other thing I might add from our own experience is, especially for those news organizations whose readership, like yours, I think, Mia, are themselves experts to a large extent, is to really tap into that community. We have found a lot of success in saying to our own readers, what are you experiencing? What are you seeing? And doing a lot more kind of first person and crowdsourced reporting, which
Yes.
not only in getting a wide range of experiences into our reporting, but also to overcome some of the challenges of not being able to be in person present. And that's been really engaging. And I think there's a lot of potential around kind of co-creation of content that we're beginning now to tap into.
Yes, crowdsource, absolutely. I don't know, I'm just agreeing with everyone else, but yes, absolutely.
Ladies, I'd like to thank all three of you for, it's been quick, but I think a lot of really interesting windows into the ways that you're working and some of the opportunities that lie out there. Adila Razak of Malaysia Kini in Malaysia, Mia Malan of Bekesisa in South Africa, and Windsar Nyong of the Doh Athan podcast in Myanmar. Thank you very much. And now I will hand back to you, Paula Frey in Johannesburg.